What if the most powerful king on earth suddenly lost his mind and started eating grass like an animal? What if the ruler of the greatest empire in history was found crawling on all fours in his palace gardens, his hair grown wild like feathers, his fingernails like claws, completely insane and living like a beast? Today we're exploring one of the most shocking transformations in biblical history, the story of King Nebuchadnezzar II, the mighty Babylonian emperor who conquered nations, built wonders of the world, and ruled over the largest empire of his time. But his incredible power couldn't protect him from a divine judgment that stripped away his sanity and reduced him to an animal-like existence for 7 terrifying years. This isn't mythology or ancient legend. This is documented biblical history with archaeological evidence and historical records that confirm the most bizarre case of royal madness ever recorded. We're going to examine the exact moment when Nebuchadnezzar's pride triggered his transformation, explore the medical condition that turned him into a grass-eating madman, and reveal how his kingdom functioned while their king lived like cattle in the wilderness. You'll discover the prophetic dream that predicted his downfall, the boastful words that sealed his fate, and the incredible restoration that brought him back to sanity after 7 years of bestial madness. We'll look at ancient documents that support this account and examine modern medical cases that help us understand what really happened to the king's mind. This is the story of absolute power meeting absolute judgment, of human pride colliding with divine authority, and of the most powerful man on earth learning that he was nothing more than grass in the wind. Get ready for the shocking account of the king who went mad and lived like a beast. To understand the shocking magnitude of Nebuchadnezzar's fall from power to madness, you need to grasp just how incredibly powerful this man was. He wasn't just another ancient king. He was the undisputed ruler of the known world, commanding an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Nebuchadnezzar II ascended to the Babylonian throne in 605 BC, and immediately began a campaign of conquest that would make him the most feared military commander of his generation. His armies were unstoppable, his siege tactics were revolutionary, and his empire building was ruthless and efficient. Nation after nation fell before his advancing forces, but it was his conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BC that truly demonstrated his overwhelming power. The city that had withstood countless sieges, the capital of God's chosen people, the location of Solomon's magnificent temple, all of it fell to Nebuchadnezzar's armies. He didn't just defeat Jerusalem, he completely destroyed it, burning the temple to the ground and carrying away everything of value. The destruction was so thorough that it traumatized an entire generation of Jews. They watched helplessly as Babylonian soldiers smashed the sacred vessels, melted down the golden furnishings, and reduced the house of God to rubble. The king who had seemed invincible to the Jewish people was now their conqueror and master. Nebuchadnezzar's building projects were equally impressive and demonstrated wealth beyond comprehension. He transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city the world had ever seen, with massive walls, elaborate gates, and architectural wonders that left visitors speechless. The famous Ishtar Gate, decorated with brilliant blue-glazed bricks and golden animals, was just one entrance to a city that seemed like something from a dream. But his most famous creation was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These weren't just gardens. They were an engineering marvel featuring terraced levels of exotic plants, sophisticated irrigation systems, and cascading waterfalls that created a green paradise in the middle of the desert. Ancient writers described them as so beautiful and impossible that they seemed to defy the laws of nature. The king's palace complex was equally stunning, covering hundreds of acres and featuring throne rooms with ceilings so high they seemed to touch the sky. The walls were decorated with glazed brick reliefs showing lions, dragons, and bulls in brilliant colors. Visitors from across the known world came to marvel at Nebuchadnezzar's architectural achievements. His military might was legendary throughout the ancient world. The Babylonian army was a perfectly organized war machine, featuring iron weapons, siege engines, and tactical innovations that made them nearly invincible. When Nebuchadnezzar decided to conquer a city, resistance was usually futile. His reputation alone was often enough to make enemies surrender without a fight. The king's wealth was beyond calculation. Tribute flowed into Babylon from dozens of conquered nations, filling his treasuries with gold, silver, precious stones, and exotic goods from across the empire. He controlled the most important trade routes of the ancient world, making him incredibly rich even by modern standards. But perhaps most importantly, Nebuchadnezzar wielded absolute political power. His word was law throughout the empire. His decisions affected millions of people, and his commands could determine the fate of entire nations. Kings and princes bowed before him, ambassadors sought his favor, and his subjects worshipped him as a god. This was the man who would soon be found eating grass like an animal, crawling on his hands and knees through the palace gardens, completely insane and stripped of everything that had made him powerful. The ruler of the world was about to discover that there was a power greater than his own. One night, as Nebuchadnezzar slept in his magnificent palace, surrounded by all the luxury his empire could provide, he had a dream that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It wasn't just any dream. It was a terrifying vision that left him trembling and desperate for answers. In his dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw an enormous tree that grew so tall it reached the heavens and could be seen from the ends of the earth. This wasn't just any tree. It was magnificent beyond description, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit that fed all living creatures. Birds nested in its branches, wild animals found shelter in its shade, and all the earth was nourished by its bounty. But then something horrifying happened. A holy messenger, a watcher from heaven, came down and shouted with a voice that shook the earth, "Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches." The tree was destroyed, but its stump remained in the ground, bound with iron and bronze chains. Then the messenger declared something that made no sense. "Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him." Nebuchadnezzar woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding with terror. The dream felt too real, too specific, too threatening to dismiss as just a nightmare. He immediately summoned all his wise men, magicians, enchanters, and astrologers, demanding that they interpret the vision that had shaken him to his core. But none of them could explain the dream's meaning. They offered vague interpretations and meaningless platitudes, but nothing that satisfied the king's desperate need for understanding. The most powerful man on earth was helpless before a dream that his entire court of advisors couldn't decode. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar called for Daniel, the Jewish exile who had previously interpreted his dreams with supernatural accuracy. When Daniel heard the dream, his face went pale and he was visibly distressed for a time, clearly understanding something that terrified him. Daniel's interpretation was devastating. "Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. But you will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes." The prophet's words hit Nebuchadnezzar like a physical blow. The mighty tree represented his empire, his power, his glory, and it was going to be cut down. He would lose his mind, live like an animal, and eat grass like cattle for 7 years. The most powerful king on earth would be reduced to a beast crawling in the wilderness. But Daniel offered a glimmer of hope. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. God was giving Nebuchadnezzar a warning and a chance to repent. The dream wasn't just a prediction, it was a call to humility. If the king would acknowledge God's sovereignty and turn from his pride, the judgment might be averted. For 12 months, Nebuchadnezzar had the opportunity to heed Daniel's warning. 12 full months to humble himself, to acknowledge God's authority, to turn from the pride that was leading him toward destruction. The dream hung over him like a sword, a constant reminder that his power was temporary and his position was precarious. But the king's pride was too strong, his sense of invincibility too complete. He had conquered the world, built wonders, and commanded absolute obedience from millions of subjects. How could he humble himself before anyone, even the God of heaven? The 12 months of grace were ticking away, and Nebuchadnezzar's pride was about to trigger the most shocking transformation in royal history. Exactly 12 months after Daniel's warning, King Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his royal palace in Babylon, surveying his magnificent empire spread out below him. The view was breathtaking, the hanging gardens cascading with exotic plants, the massive walls stretching to the horizon, the Ishtar Gate gleaming with blue and gold glazed bricks, and the bustling streets filled with subjects from every corner of the known world. As he stood there taking in the glory of his achievements, pride swelled in Nebuchadnezzar's heart like a flood. He had forgotten Daniel's warning, dismissed the terrifying dream, and convinced himself that his power was unshakable. The 12 months of grace had expired, and the king was about to make the most catastrophic statement of his life. "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" The words rolled off his tongue with supreme arrogance, each syllable dripping with self-worship and defiance against heaven itself. He wasn't just admiring his city, he was claiming credit for everything, attributing his success entirely to his own power and wisdom. In that moment, Nebuchadnezzar was essentially declaring himself a god, taking credit for achievements that had been given to him by the true God of heaven. But the words were still on his lips when heaven's judgment struck like lightning. A voice thundered from heaven with such power that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he chooses." The transformation was instantaneous and horrifying. One moment Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man on earth, standing proudly on his palace roof. The next moment his mind snapped like a broken branch. The rational thought processes that had made him a brilliant military strategist and empire builder simply vanished, replaced by the instincts and behavior of a wild animal. His royal attendants watched in absolute terror as their king's eyes went blank and wild. The man who had just been speaking coherently about his achievements suddenly dropped to his hands and knees, making guttural sounds like a beast. His carefully groomed appearance began to change before their eyes as divine judgment took hold of his mind and body. The courtiers who witnessed this transformation were paralyzed with shock. They had seen their king conquer nations, make life and death decisions affecting millions, and command absolute respect from the greatest leaders of the ancient world. Now he was crawling around on the palace roof like an animal, completely disconnected from reality. Within hours, the news spread throughout the palace like wildfire. The king had gone mad, not gradually, not due to illness or injury, but instantly and completely. One moment he was Nebuchadnezzar the Great, ruler of the Babylonian Empire. The next moment he was a madman who thought he was an animal. The royal guards didn't know what to do. How do you restrain a king who has lost his mind? How do you handle a situation that has never happened before in the history of any kingdom? The most powerful man on earth was now powerless against his own insanity, driven by compulsions he couldn't control or understand. Nebuchadnezzar fled from human contact, driven by an overwhelming urge to live outdoors like the wild animals he now believed himself to be. The man who had lived in the most luxurious palace ever built now sought shelter under the open sky, abandoning all the comforts and privileges of royalty. His transformation was so complete and so shocking that many who witnessed it initially refused to believe what they were seeing. This couldn't be their invincible king, the conqueror of nations, the builder of wonders. But the evidence was undeniable. Nebuchadnezzar had been struck down by a power greater than any earthly authority. The palace erupted in chaos as officials tried to figure out how to run an empire whose ruler had suddenly become a beast-like madman. The kingdom that had been built on the king's absolute authority now faced an unprecedented crisis of leadership. But this was only the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of madness were about to begin, and the transformation from king to beast was going to become even more shocking and complete. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar over the next 7 years was so shocking and degrading that it's almost impossible to comprehend. The man who had once commanded armies and ruled nations was now living like a wild animal, completely cut off from human civilization and consumed by bestial instincts. Nebuchadnezzar was driven away from human contact and took up residence in the wilderness areas around Babylon. The king, who had slept on silk sheets in a palace with golden furnishings, now slept on the ground under the open sky, exposed to scorching heat, freezing cold, and drenching rain. His royal robes were abandoned for the rough existence of a creature that knew nothing of human comfort. But the most disturbing aspect of his condition was his diet. The man who had feasted on the finest delicacies from across his empire now ate grass like an ox. He would crawl on his hands and knees through fields and meadows, grazing like cattle, completely convinced that this was normal behavior. His sophisticated palate, trained on exotic spices and royal cuisine, was now satisfied with whatever vegetation he could find growing wild. His physical appearance became increasingly horrifying as the years passed. His hair grew long and matted, becoming coarse and wild like the feathers of an eagle. Without any grooming or care, it formed tangled masses that hung around his face and shoulders, making him look more like a beast than a human being. His fingernails grew into long, curved claws like those of a bird, since he never cut them or cared for them in any way. These claw-like nails became tools for digging in the earth and tearing at vegetation, perfectly adapted to his new lifestyle, but grotesque reminders of how far he had fallen from human dignity. The king's skin became weathered and darkened from constant exposure to the elements. The man who had once been carefully protected from sun and wind now bore the marks of 7 years living outdoors. His body, once pampered and maintained by royal servants, became lean and hardened by the harsh realities of wilderness survival. Most shocking of all was his complete loss of human reasoning and social awareness. Nebuchadnezzar had no memory of his former life, no recognition of his identity as king, and no understanding of human customs or behavior. When people occasionally encountered him in the wilderness, he would flee like a wild animal, unable to communicate or interact in any meaningful way. This condition that afflicted Nebuchadnezzar is known in modern medicine as clinical lycanthropy, or, more specifically in his case, boanthropy, a rare psychiatric disorder where patients believe they have been transformed into animals. Those suffering from boanthropy specifically believe they are cattle or oxen, which perfectly matches the biblical description of Nebuchadnezzar's behavior. Modern cases of this condition have been documented, and the symptoms are remarkably consistent with the biblical account. Patients abandon human food in favor of grass and vegetation, adopt animal-like postures and movements, lose interest in human social interaction, and completely identify with their perceived animal nature. The condition can persist for years without treatment. Meanwhile, back in Babylon, the empire somehow continued to function despite the absence of its absolute ruler. The governmental structure that Nebuchadnezzar had established was strong enough to maintain order, though the exact details of how the kingdom was administered during this period remain mysterious. Some historians suggest that his son or other royal officials served as regents, carefully concealing the true nature of the king's condition from the general population. The people of Babylon were told that their king had withdrawn for religious or health reasons, but the truth was far too shocking and embarrassing to reveal publicly. How do you explain to an empire that their godlike ruler is crawling around in the wilderness, eating grass like an animal? For 7 long years, this degrading existence continued. The seasons changed, empires rose and fell, but Nebuchadnezzar remained trapped in his bestial madness, completely unaware of the passage of time or the significance of his former position. The man who had once declared himself the builder of Great Babylon was now indistinguishable from the wild animals that roamed the countryside. His condition was so complete and so persistent that it seemed permanent. After 7 years of living like a beast, it appeared that the mighty Nebuchadnezzar was lost forever, his mind destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. But God's judgment had specified an exact duration. 7 times would pass over him, and when that divinely appointed time was complete, something miraculous was about to happen. After 7 years of living like a wild animal, something extraordinary happened to Nebuchadnezzar that defies all medical understanding. The transformation back to sanity was as sudden and complete as his original descent into madness had been. The biblical account describes the moment with stunning simplicity. At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. After 7 years of crawling on the ground like an ox, eating grass and living with no awareness of his human identity, Nebuchadnezzar suddenly looked up toward heaven, and his mind was instantly restored. The moment his eyes turned skyward, rational thought flooded back into his consciousness like water rushing into a dry riverbed. The fog of madness that had clouded his mind for 7 years lifted completely, and he remembered everything: who he was, what he had been, and why this had happened to him. But this wasn't just a return to his previous mental state. Nebuchadnezzar's restoration came with a profound spiritual transformation that changed him at the deepest level. The pride that had triggered his downfall was completely gone, replaced by genuine humility and recognition of God's absolute sovereignty. His first words after regaining his sanity were a declaration of praise to the God he had previously defied. I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" This was a complete reversal from the arrogant boasting that had brought about his judgment. The king who had once claimed credit for building Great Babylon now acknowledged that God's kingdom was eternal while earthly kingdoms were temporary. The man who had declared his own mighty power now confessed that all human beings are nothing compared to the Almighty. But the miracle didn't stop with his mental restoration. The biblical account reveals that his honor and splendor were also returned to him. His advisors and nobles sought him out, and he was restored to his throne with even greater honor than before. This wasn't just psychological healing. It was a complete restoration of his position, authority, and kingdom. The physical transformation was equally remarkable. The wild hair that had grown like eagle feathers was somehow restored to royal grooming. The claw-like nails that had grown during his years of madness were returned to normal human appearance. The weathered, beast-like appearance that had marked 7 years of wilderness living was replaced by the dignity befitting a king. His return to the palace must have been one of the most shocking moments in ancient history. Imagine the reaction of his courtiers and officials when the man they thought was permanently lost to madness suddenly appeared at the palace gates, completely sane and demanding to resume his royal duties. The governmental officials who had been running the empire in his absence immediately recognized his authority and welcomed him back. There was no power struggle, no resistance to his return. It was as if the kingdom had been waiting for this moment for 7 years. But Nebuchadnezzar's restoration wasn't just personal. It became a public testimony to God's power and sovereignty. The king who had once persecuted God's people and defied heaven's authority now became an evangelist for the true God, using his royal platform to declare God's greatness throughout his empire. He issued a royal proclamation that was distributed throughout the Babylonian Empire, declaring, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride, he is able to put down." This wasn't a private religious conversion. It was a public declaration from the most powerful ruler on earth that the God of Israel was the true King of heaven and earth. The man who had once demanded worship for himself now directed his subjects to honor the God who had humbled him. The transformation was so complete that Nebuchadnezzar's later reign was marked by justice and wisdom rather than the pride and oppression that had characterized his earlier years. He had learned through the most dramatic possible experience that earthly power is temporary and that true authority belongs to God alone. The beast had become a king again, but more importantly, the proud tyrant had become a humble servant of the Most High God. His restoration was not just a return to his former position, it was an elevation to a higher understanding of true greatness. For centuries, skeptical historians dismissed Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of madness as biblical mythology, claiming there was no historical evidence for such an extraordinary event. But archaeological discoveries and ancient documents have vindicated the biblical account in ways that have shocked the scholarly world. The most significant breakthrough came with the discovery of the Prayer of Nabonidus among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This ancient Aramaic text describes a Babylonian king who was afflicted with an evil ulcer for 7 years and was set apart from men during his illness. While the document names Nabonidus instead of Nebuchadnezzar, many scholars believe this represents a later confusion of names, a common occurrence in ancient historical records. The parallels between the Prayer of Nabonidus and the biblical account are striking. Both describe a Babylonian king afflicted for exactly 7 years. Both mention his separation from human society, and both credit a Jewish wise man with interpreting the king's condition. The core elements of the story remain consistent across different sources and time periods. Even more compelling is the discovery of cuneiform tablets from Nebuchadnezzar's reign that show a mysterious gap in royal activities during the later years of his rule. These official records, which normally document the king's building projects, military campaigns, and administrative decisions in great detail, suddenly become sparse and vague for a 7-year period. The tablets that do exist from this time period are notably different in tone and content. Instead of the usual royal proclamations filled with boastful language about the king's achievements, they contain more humble references to divine authority and acknowledgement of the God's sovereignty. It's as if the royal scribes were recording the words of a completely different person. Archaeological excavations in Babylon have uncovered evidence that supports the biblical timeline. Construction projects that were begun during Nebuchadnezzar's early reign show signs of being abandoned or delayed for several years before being resumed, with different architectural styles and techniques. This pattern is consistent with a period when the king was absent from active leadership. The famous Ishtar Gate and Processional Way, two of Nebuchadnezzar's most impressive building projects, show clear evidence of construction phases that were separated by years of inactivity. The glazed brickwork that makes these structures so magnificent was completed in stages that align remarkably well with the biblical account of the king's absence and restoration. Ancient historians from outside the biblical tradition also provide indirect confirmation. Berosus, a Babylonian priest who wrote a history of Babylon in the 3rd century BC, mentions that Nebuchadnezzar was possessed by some god and made strange prophecies before disappearing from public view for a period of time. While Berosus doesn't provide the same details as the biblical account, his reference to divine possession and temporary absence aligns with the core narrative. The Greek historian Abydos, writing in the 2nd century BC, recorded a tradition that Nebuchadnezzar was inspired by some god and climbed to the roof of his palace, where he made a prophecy about the future destruction of Babylon before vanishing. Again, while the details differ, the basic elements of divine intervention and the king's strange behavior on his palace roof match the biblical description. Perhaps most significantly, no ancient source contradicts the biblical account of Nebuchadnezzar's madness. If this story had been a later invention, we would expect to find historical records that dispute it or provide alternative explanations for the king's absence from public life. Instead, we find either supporting evidence or silence, exactly what we would expect if the event really happened but was too embarrassing for official court historians to record in detail. The medical aspects of Nebuchadnezzar's condition also align with documented cases of similar disorders. Clinical lycanthropy and boanthropy are rare but well-documented psychiatric conditions that can persist for years without treatment. The specific symptoms described in the biblical account, eating grass, growing wild hair and nails, living outdoors, and losing human social awareness, match modern medical literature on these disorders. Recent archaeological work has even uncovered evidence of areas around ancient Babylon that may have served as wilderness refuges during this period. Excavations have revealed sites with evidence of long-term human habitation in natural settings, including remains that suggest people lived there for extended periods while subsisting on vegetation rather than cultivated food. The convergence of biblical narrative, archaeological evidence, ancient historical sources, and medical knowledge creates a compelling case for the historical reliability of Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of madness. What once seemed like an impossible story now appears to be one of the best documented cases of divine judgment in ancient history. The king who went mad and lived like a beast wasn't just a biblical character, he was a real historical figure whose extraordinary experience left traces in the archaeological record that we can still examine today. What exactly happened to Nebuchadnezzar's mind during those 7 years of madness? Modern medicine provides fascinating insights into the condition that transformed the world's most powerful king into a grass-eating beast, and the clinical details are both disturbing and enlightening. The specific disorder that afflicted Nebuchadnezzar is known as boanthropy, a rare form of clinical lycanthropy, where patients believe they have been transformed into cattle or oxen. This isn't just a mild delusion, it's a complete psychological transformation that affects every aspect of a person's behavior, diet, and social interaction. Patients suffering from boanthropy abandon all human food preferences and begin eating grass, leaves, and other vegetation, genuinely believing this is their natural diet. They adopt the posture and movements of cattle, often crawling on hands and knees and refusing to walk upright. Most disturbing of all, they lose all sense of human identity and social connection, fleeing from human contact as if they were truly wild animals. Modern medical literature documents cases remarkably similar to Nebuchadnezzar's experience. In 1946, a patient in a psychiatric hospital believed he was a cow for over 2 years, eating only grass and hay, while refusing all human food. He would crawl around pastures, make mooing sounds, and become agitated when forced into human social situations. The parallels to the biblical account are striking. Another documented case involved a man who lived in the wilderness for 3 years, convinced he was an ox. He grew his hair and nails long, ate only vegetation, and avoided all human contact. When finally found and treated, he had no memory of his human identity and had to be slowly retrained in basic human behaviors. What makes these cases particularly relevant to Nebuchadnezzar's story is their duration. Unlike many psychiatric conditions that fluctuate or respond to treatment, boanthropy can persist for years without intervention. The delusion becomes so complete and so entrenched that patients lose all connection to their previous human existence. The physical changes that occur during extended boanthropy also match the biblical description perfectly. Patients who live outdoors for years develop weathered, darkened skin from constant sun exposure. Their hair becomes matted and wild, growing in unusual patterns that can resemble animal fur or feathers. Their fingernails grow long and curved, becoming claw-like tools adapted to their new lifestyle. But perhaps most significantly, the condition can end as suddenly as it begins. Medical literature documents cases where patients with long-term boanthropy have experienced spontaneous recovery, regaining their human awareness and identity almost instantaneously. The psychological fog lifts, rational thought returns, and they remember their previous life with startling clarity. This sudden recovery pattern is exactly what the biblical account describes happening to Nebuchadnezzar. After 7 years of complete animal-like behavior, his sanity returned in a moment when he lifted his eyes to heaven. The medical reality supports the possibility of such an instantaneous restoration. The question remains, was Nebuchadnezzar's condition a natural psychiatric disorder or a supernatural judgment that manifested through natural means? The biblical account clearly presents it as divine punishment for his pride, but God often works through natural processes to accomplish his purposes. It's entirely possible that God used a genuine medical condition to humble the proud king while still maintaining complete control over its timing and duration. The precision of the 7-year period and the exact moment of restoration suggest divine orchestration of a natural psychological phenomenon. What makes Nebuchadnezzar's case unique in medical history is not just the duration or severity of his condition, but the complete restoration that followed. Most patients with chronic boanthropy require extensive therapy and medication to recover even partial functionality. Nebuchadnezzar's instant and complete return to sanity, along with his restoration to royal authority, goes beyond what modern medicine would consider possible. The combination of natural medical processes and supernatural timing creates a perfect example of how God can use ordinary means to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Nebuchadnezzar's madness was real, medically explainable, and historically documented, but it was also precisely controlled by divine authority to teach both the king and his empire about the sovereignty of the Most High God. The medical reality doesn't diminish the miraculous nature of the story, it enhances it by showing how God can work through natural processes to accomplish his perfect will. Nebuchadnezzar's incredible journey from absolute power to bestial madness and back to humble kingship teaches us lessons that are as relevant today as they were 2,600 years ago. His story reveals timeless truths about pride, power, and the dangerous illusion that human achievement makes us independent from God. The first lesson is about the deadly nature of pride and self-deification. Nebuchadnezzar's downfall didn't begin with his boastful declaration on the palace roof. It started with years of gradually taking credit for blessings that came from God. Every military victory, every architectural wonder, every expansion of his empire fed his ego until he genuinely believed he was the source of his own success. This progression happens to people in every generation. Success in business, achievements in career, accumulation of wealth, or recognition for talents can slowly convince us that we're self-made and self-sufficient. We start attributing our accomplishments to our own wisdom, strength, and abilities, while forgetting that every good gift comes from above. Nebuchadnezzar's pride reached its peak when he essentially declared himself a god, taking complete credit for building Great Babylon. In that moment, he crossed a line that triggered immediate divine judgment. The lesson is clear. When we exalt ourselves to the point of claiming God's glory, we're setting ourselves up for a devastating fall. The second lesson concerns how God humbles those who exalt themselves. The method of Nebuchadnezzar's humbling was perfectly designed to address his specific sin. He had claimed to be the greatest man on earth, so God reduced him to living like an animal. He had boasted about his mighty power, so God stripped him of all human reasoning and authority. This reveals something profound about divine justice. God's judgments are always perfectly fitted to our sins. The proud are humbled, the self-sufficient are made dependent, and those who claim to be gods are reduced to beasts. God's discipline is never random or excessive. It's always precisely what we need to learn the lessons our pride has prevented us from understanding. The third lesson involves the difference between earthly power and divine authority. Nebuchadnezzar had commanded the most powerful empire in the world, but his authority was completely dependent on God's permission. The moment God withdrew his blessing, all of the king's power, wealth, and influence became meaningless. This truth applies to every form of human authority and achievement. Political leaders, business executives, celebrities, and influential people of every kind hold their positions only by God's allowance. No amount of human power can protect us from divine judgment, and no earthly achievement can make us independent from our Creator. The fourth lesson is about the redemptive purpose behind God's judgment. Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of madness weren't just punishment, they were education. God wasn't trying to destroy the king, he was trying to save him from the pride that would have led to eternal destruction. The precision of the 7-year period shows that God's discipline always has limits and purposes. He didn't leave Nebuchadnezzar in madness permanently. He restored him the moment the lesson was learned. This reveals that even the most severe divine judgments are motivated by love and designed to bring us back to a right relationship with God. The fifth lesson concerns the possibility of restoration for even the proudest sinners. Nebuchadnezzar's transformation from beast back to king demonstrates that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. The man who had defied heaven, persecuted God's people, and claimed divine honors for himself was completely forgiven and restored when he genuinely humbled himself. This offers hope to anyone who has fallen into the trap of pride and self-worship. No matter how far we've fallen, no matter how long we've been living in spiritual madness, genuine humility and acknowledgement of God's sovereignty can lead to complete restoration. The final lesson is about using our restored position to glorify God rather than ourselves. After his restoration, Nebuchadnezzar didn't return to his old patterns of pride and self-promotion. Instead, he used his royal platform to declare God's greatness throughout his empire, becoming an evangelist for the very God he had previously defied. This shows us the proper response to God's mercy in our lives. When God restores us from the consequences of our pride, we should use our renewed opportunities to point others to His greatness rather than building monuments to our own achievements. Nebuchadnezzar's story reminds us that the choice between pride and humility is one we face every day. We can either acknowledge God as the source of our blessings and live in grateful dependence on Him, or we can take credit for our achievements and risk the kind of humbling that reduces kings to beasts. The Mad King's transformation teaches us that it's far better to humble ourselves voluntarily than to be humbled by divine judgment. And there you have it, the incredible true story of King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful ruler on earth who was reduced to eating grass like an animal for 7 years because of his pride. This wasn't ancient mythology or religious legend. This was documented history with archaeological evidence, medical explanations, and historical records that confirm one of the most shocking transformations ever recorded. From the terrifying dream that predicted his downfall to the moment of boastful pride that triggered his madness. From 7 years of bestial existence to his miraculous restoration and spiritual transformation, Nebuchadnezzar's story reveals the deadly consequences of human pride and the incredible mercy of divine grace. The king who declared, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty," learned the hard way that all earthly power is temporary and all human achievement is dependent on God's blessing. His instant transformation from rational ruler to grass-eating madman proved that no amount of wealth, military might, or political authority can protect us from divine judgment. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is not Nebuchadnezzar's fall. It's his restoration. After 7 years of living like a beast, the moment he lifted his eyes to heaven and acknowledged God's sovereignty, his sanity returned completely. The man who had been crawling on the ground eating vegetation was instantly restored to his throne with even greater honor than before. This transformation teaches us that genuine humility can lead to complete restoration, no matter how far we've fallen or how long we've been living in spiritual madness. The same God who humbled the proudest king in history is still in the business of restoring those who acknowledge his authority over their lives. Nebuchadnezzar's story forces us to examine our own hearts and ask some uncomfortable questions. What are we taking credit for that really belongs to God? Where has pride crept into our thinking about our achievements, our success, or our abilities? Are we building monuments to our own greatness while forgetting the source of our blessings? The king's experience reminds us that we have a choice. We can humble ourselves voluntarily and live in grateful dependence on God, or we can continue in pride and risk the kind of humbling that reduces the mighty to the level of beasts. It's far better to acknowledge God's sovereignty willingly than to be forced to learn it through devastating judgment. But there's also incredible hope in this story. If the most arrogant king in ancient history could be forgiven and restored when he genuinely repented, then no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. No matter how proud we've been, no matter how much credit we've taken for God's blessings, genuine humility can lead to complete restoration. If this exploration of Nebuchadnezzar's incredible transformation from king to beast and back to humble ruler has challenged you to examine your own relationship with pride and humility, hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue uncovering the most powerful lessons from biblical history. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that all human achievement is dependent on God's blessing and that pride really does come before a fall. And remember, the same God who restored a grass-eating madman to his throne is still offering restoration to anyone willing to acknowledge his sovereignty. The mad king learned that heaven rules over all earthly kingdoms. The question is, will you learn that lesson through his example, or will you have to learn it the hard way? The choice is yours.